Something similar is taking place in Catholicism as well, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. When we were in the 19th century, we talked about the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was Pope Leo XIII's kind of overview of the social problems, ultimately siding with capitalism and private property, but saying that capitalism needed changes, that there was something inherently positive about private property, but people were getting exploited. Of course, a lot of Catholic immigrants in the United States were being exploited by management. Well, in 1931, Pius XI, who is Pope at the time, releases the papal encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, which stands for after 40 years. So it's been 40 years since Rerum Novarum, this very pivotal encyclical papal document on social capital, the rights of workers, those kind of things. And so it's been 40 years since then. And so he's kind of reflecting on where has society gone in these 40 years, how do we continue to make Rerum Novarum applicable to Catholic life in the 1930s. Now think about it, 1931. Early years of the Great Depression, there's been financial panics, there's stock market crashes, completely different situation than the 1890s when Rerum Novarum was written. There was a lot of optimism, and you have the robber barons and all this kind of progress and these kind of things, and now you have this completely different type of situation. And in fact, Quadragesimo Anno was Pius's attempt to reflect on the world. What's happened in these 40 years? How do we understand the Great Depression, and how does the Catholic Church respond to this? And what we see here is a shift in Catholic social thought from talking about charity. And charity's always been very important for a lot of Catholics, especially monks, nuns, priests, doing charitable works. Pius says we need to make a change from charity to justice, social justice. Right? And so it's not just about helping individuals, but transforming society. In fact, Pius called the church to re-examine the views of Thomas Aquinas, a Catholic theologian from the 1200s. And out of it, he essentially wanted to say that the Catholic Church needed to oppose economic injustice. And while Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum felt that private property was a divine right, a God-given right, Pius is more open to socialism. In fact, in the encyclical says the government should adjust ownership to meet the needs of the public good. Right? So if it would serve the public good, right, if it would serve the people, government might need to get involved in the ownership of business and the ownership of property. Now, it's not a full-blown socialism, but it's definitely a softened stance when you compare Rerum Novarum to Quadragesimo Anno. And you also see more and more support for labor unions. And the people wanting to band together and work in solidarity to try and get concessions from management for living wages, protection on the job, other types of things that we might take for granted today. And so there's more support here from Pius for Catholics to be involved in labor unions. Quadragesimo Anno was widely preached in Catholic circles and was a part of what we might call Catholic action. This move from charity to social justice. The shift played out itself in a variety of ways. I want to talk about two: the rise of labor unions and the impact of famous Catholics. In the 1890s, there had been a fairly ambivalent relationship between church and the Catholic Church and labor unions, because labor unions were often connected to the socialism developing in Europe in the time. And since there was an opposition to socialism in the late 19th century. There was often an opposition to labor unions. Ultimately, Catholics felt that it would cause these kind of conflicting loyalties for Catholics to be involved in labor unions. You'd have the loyalties to the church and loyalties to the government and loyalties to unions. And so in the late 19th century, there was a lot of suspicion of labor unions in Catholicism. Now, that's one thing in these Catholic areas in Europe, but in America in the 1890s, the working class tended to be Catholic, or many Catholics tended to be working class, I should say. So Catholics tended to be non-professional laborers. And so they didn't have the same kind of opportunities as Catholics in Europe might have. And so ultimately this led to the church, in things like Quadragesimo Anno, to be more open to labor unions. And so in the 19-teens, Catholics began joining labor unions in large numbers, and ultimately believed, as we get into the 30s, that Quadragesimo Anno gave the government the right to regulate relationships between workers and management. So Catholics were very supportive of Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, other types of governmental action to try to help people economically. Especially in the United States, a lot of the priests became labor priests. They were out there encouraging laborers in these unions. They were taking political stances on the relationship between labor and management. They would be out there on the picket line with the union that was striking against certain positions of management. And ultimately, these labor priests became reformer priests. They preached this social vision of the church, an outward-oriented vision. But often, a lot of these labor priests, especially among the Irish in the Midwest, tended to be incredibly liberal, especially on economic issues, things that probably a lot of other Catholics wouldn't necessarily support. And so you have these kind of Catholic liberal priests who advocate widespread reform of capitalism and the government. On the other hand, you have other famous Catholics who weren't necessarily part of the church hierarchy that were also involved in these movements, people like Dorothy Day. Day was a Catholic convert born in Brooklyn in the late 19th century, and her early life, she was very radical. And in fact had been involved in several movements who supported anarchy, right, the notion of society without governmental rules. In 1927, though, she converts to Catholicism. When she converts, she's a committed socialist. But after her conversion, she tries to find this way to bring Catholicism and socialism together. Certainly, a lot of socialists and a lot of people that Day associated with before her conversion had been atheists. And out of this, of course, she has this very idealistic notions of society and social reform, but she's accepted a lot of the traditional beliefs of Catholicism. So there's kind of this tension because of the hierarchy as well as what she's looking for in society. In 1932, she meets a man named Peter Maurin, who together form the Catholic Worker. Morin believed in a return to agrarian society, right? Even though he lives in the city. Right? He wants to see society become this very agrarian, rural, live off the land, but here he is living in the city. But for a lot of his life, he lived in voluntary poverty and used money to help others. Originally, the Catholic Worker was a labor paper. Right? It was a newspaper for common workers to read about issues related to labor. Day would write articles in there, and so there would be kind of this thinking about labor, but then there would also be, news about strikes and demonstrations and other types of things as well. It was a penny to buy a copy of the Catholic Worker. If I'm correct, it's still only a penny still around. Ultimately, the Catholic Worker starts as a newspaper, but then kind of morphs into this movement, in a sense. And so Day and some others try to make this something broader than just this paper. But ultimately, it's this kind of utopian movement. They're hoping to see these great changes in society, this very positive change in society. And in fact, they advocated what we could call radical acts of mercy, really kind of thinking about the condition of the poor. And so she set up in various places throughout the United States what were called houses of hospitality. These were places where anyone could come for food, for clothing, and shelter. Right? Very similar to what we might think of with the Salvation Army, but remember, Salvation Army is a Protestant movement, right? So this is a more Catholic movement. She too advocated voluntary poverty, living on very little to help others. Ultimately, though, she continued to identify with radicals and communists because she believed that they related better with the sacrifice of Christ. Right? Christ in the solidarity with suffering people. And Christ accepting other people's suffering. These are the kind of things that she tended to emphasize. There was always an uneasy relationship between Day and the hierarchy because she didn't become a nun. She wasn't involved in a Catholic order, so she's just a common Catholic. And so there's that kind of tension between the priests and the bishops and the common Catholic, and she's very active here. And plus the male-female relationships, right? The male hierarchy and this woman being very active here. Ultimately, though, we can say Day was very devout. Right? She not only wrote about labor, but she often wrote about her own personal spirituality, and those things were published and read as well. Very obedient. She never officially challenged the church, believed in the wisdom of the church, but in other places she challenged it as well. And ultimately, really kind of laid the foundations for a Catholic peace movement. And so towards the end of the 20th century, some of the most outspoken critics of nuclear war and some of the involvement in some of the conflicts we think about in the 20th century were Catholic bishops and Catholic priests. And they kind of helped establish this kind of peace movement. War, she felt, violated the dignity of human beings. It improperly used resources to hurt people, resources that could be used to feed, to shelter. And ultimately, she advocated, this kind of pacifism towards the war, towards the world, I should say. What questions do you have about Catholic action? What can I maybe clarify a little bit here? Let's then turn to another important cultural movement in the 20th century that's kind of also a part of this push for social justice, particularly in this aspect, race issues. A lot of the things we talked about previously, economic issues, this much more focused on race. Now, while the push for civil rights often was politically focused, right? Wanted people involved in the civil rights movement wanting to see legislation passed or other legislation revoked, the leaders often came from churches. And so even though a lot of times it's presented in a historic, like if you think about it in a public school classroom, it's presented politically with the culmination of the Civil Rights Act, there's a very religious component here. And a lot of people were involved with it, were doing it out of Christian motives. Now certainly, the opposition to civil rights sometimes also came from churches. Right? So Christians are lining up on both sides of the issue here. And we've talked about this already, right? Sometimes it was churches preaching against civil rights, claiming that God wanted the races segregated. In fact, there were sometimes churches and ministers preaching against the political activity of ministers. Jerry Falwell, for example, who would eventually start the Moral Majority that we talked about last Wednesday, preached in the early 60s against ministers being involved in marches for equality. Ministers, he felt, should not be involved in politics. 16 years later, however, he's changed his mind and is at the forefront of the religious right. Certainly, you're well aware of this, but the most famous minister involved in the push for civil rights was Martin Luther King Jr. There's some question about King's origins. It's from his name. Certainly, in the context of our class, when you hear Martin Luther King Jr., you would think about the Protestant reformer. He was born Michael King in 1929. And there's some question about whether it was intended for him to be named Martin Luther King at his birth or not. But officially, on his birth certificate, it was Michael King, and then later he and his father started using Martin Luther King to connect with the Protestant reformer. His father was also a minister, and Martin Jr. became a minister in 1948. In 1954, he became minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church here in Montgomery. He received a doctorate in systematic theology from Boston University in 1955. Ironically, it was later discovered that sizable parts of his dissertation were actually plagiarized. But his doctorate was not revoked. So that's why you hear people talking about Dr. King. It came to the forefront of attention in 1955 during the Montgomery bus boycott, which again is probably familiar to you. Rosa Parks had refused to give up her bus seat to a white patron, which was the policy at the time. She was defended by Fred Gray, a part-time minister in the Montgomery area Churches of Christ, and also a lawyer. And of course, Jones Law School frequently has, or annually has, the Gray Lectureship, or the conference. King here led a successful year-long boycott against the bus system that resulted in the integration of Montgomery buses. Because as African Americans refused to take the bus, that economically hampered the Montgomery Transit Authority, and so integration took place. Eventually, his leadership in civil rights pushed King away from full-time ministry towards spending time with groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and other civil rights activities. King was very active in a variety of causes throughout the South, and much of his emphasis was on nonviolent resistance. Right? Not, in using a nonviolent approach. Now, ultimately here, he's influenced by a couple of things. He's influenced by Rauschenbusch's social gospel. Rauschenbusch is very important here, that we just talked about just a couple of minutes ago. He's influenced by Sermon on the Mount, right, from the Gospel of Matthew. And he's also influenced by the nonviolent resistance of Mahatma Gandhi in India. In India, Gandhi had used nonviolent resistance to end British occupation of India and bring about a democracy. Gandhi, too, had been influenced by the Sermon on the Mount, even though he was Hindu. He had read about Jesus' position and what Jesus says in Matthew there. And even though he remains Hindu, he doesn't become Christian, he took a lot of Jesus' ideas to kind of support this. So, we're having a lot of Christian influence here, kind of culminating through a variety of streams with King. Nonviolent resistance was expressed in things like boycotts, like the buses, sit-ins, marches, and those were the frequent tools used by civil rights. Certainly there were more violent and more extremist wings, more groups in the push for equality. But from King's standpoint, the emphasis was on nonviolence. However, this nonviolence was often met with violence. Of course, just recently, remembering the march from Selma to Montgomery, and a lot of other types of situations where nonviolent protests, marches, sit-ins were met with fire hoses being turned on people, people being beaten, dogs being set to attack people. And although we might think it's irony, it's these very things that caused the popular opinion to change. as people saw on the evening news, defenseless U.S. citizens being attacked by dogs, fire hoses, for doing nothing in a violent way, that gradually moved the position towards King's side. But often King faced opposition from white clergy who thought his activities would create civil disturbances. And ultimately, again, this push for a gradualist approach, just gradually let it take place. His opposition to this is evident in work like Letter from the Birmingham City Jail, which King writes in April of 1963. And so here's this white clergy in Birmingham complaining that King's in the city, he's causing this disturbance, he's a minister, he shouldn't be doing these kind of things. And so Letter from the Birmingham City Jail is King's response to this opposition. The center of the African American struggle, said King, was the meaning of Christian discipleship. If you wanted to know what Christian discipleship was about, you should look at this push for right. King wrote, I'm in Birmingham. Right? A lot of he's a minister in Birmingham. What's he doing here in Birmingham? I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their thus saith the Lord far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and city of the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my particular hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. And certainly I'm not doing this any justice to the power of King's words here. You deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham. Right? They're complaining that here are these demonstrators. But I am sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. Right? You're concerned about the demonstrations, but you're not concerned about the issues that led to the demonstrations. But as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a bit of satisfaction from being considered an extremist. Was not Jesus an extremist in love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the gospel of Jesus Christ? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I can do none other, so help me God. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? This nation cannot survive half slave and half free. Was not Thomas Jefferson an extremist? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice, or will we be extremists for the cause of justice? Of course, it's very important, and this is one of the things that often gets lost, especially in public schools, to remember King's credentials as a minister, and to understand his speeches not as speeches, but as sermons. And really one of his most famous speeches, the I Have a Dream speech, is a sermon. And if you go back and listen to it, it becomes very obvious that he is preaching. He is not just there politically stumping for civil rights. He is preaching. The I Have a Dream speech was given on August 28, 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington for Civil Rights. I mean, think about those last lines. And when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and hamlet, from every state and city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Catholics and Protestants, will be able to join hands and to sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Toward the end of his life, King began to broaden his attention beyond just injustice against African Americans in the United States, to injustice globally. And toward the end of his life, he was very concerned about U.S. involvement in Vietnam, for example. And so he spoke against that, even though what he's speaking against isn't so much issues of race as it is about imperialism and violence and some other things, right? So it's a larger concern and not just about justice for African Americans. Another aspect of American culture in the 1960s that would do with some attention in our look at culture and society in relationship with Christianity is pluralism. Now, the United States has never been totally a Christian nation. There's been no time in the history of anything what we might call America that has been totally Christians are the only ones there. There's always been variety, diversity. And even during the colonial period, there have been other religions, or religions other than Christianity, present on the American continent. Of course, that's not even thinking about if we include Native American cultural lifestyles. Right? And certainly within Christianity, there has been a broad diversity, Catholics and Protestants, and even all sorts of different Protestant groups. And certainly in the late 19th century, that diversity increased as more Catholics, Orthodox Christians, additional Protestant groups, Muslims, Jews, people of other faiths and nationalities immigrated to the United States from their nations. And so it makes it even more diverse than it was. Now certainly, in the latter part of the 19th century, it is a predominantly white Protestant country. But there's a lot of other diversity as well. And we talked about this a little bit in the 19th century, but even into the early 20th century, many Protestants are concerned about this increasing diversity and what it might mean for the influence that Protestant Christians had on the United States. In 1924, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, sometimes referred to as the Johnson-Reed Act. Essentially, this act created quotas of the number of people that would be allowed into the United States each year. And it was based on the 1890 census. So Congress looked at the 1890 census of the United States and looked at the population makeup of the people and used that information to determine their quotas. Now this means, of course, that people from, or nations like Great Britain, Germany, some other places like that, would be allowed to send more people to the United States because the makeup of the United States in 1890, a lot of people came from Great Britain in their background, Germany in their background, other places like that. But places like Eastern Europe, Asia, had very, very small representations in population in 1890, and so they had very smaller quotas. In fact, that one of the things where this was an obvious impact was with the Holocaust. And Jews that could have escaped from Europe couldn't come to the United States in mass numbers because of the quotas. There weren't a lot of Eastern European Jews in the United States in 1890, and so there wasn't this openness to receiving a lot of Eastern European Jews. Yes, a lot of Jews made it to Great Britain, made it to the United States, but more could have been perhaps saved had those quotas not been in place. And ultimately, a lot of them religiously motivated from certain Christian views. In 1965, however, Congress passed the Hart-Celler Act, named after two congressmen, which did away with the quota system on immigration. There was a large influx of immigrants after 1965, many of them from Asia, and that brought Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, other groups to the United States in even greater numbers. Which meant that Christians in the United States were now coming into contact in greater numbers with Eastern religions especially. With this influx of Eastern religions, there were many in the United States, even those in Christian groups, that were interested in these religious systems and looking at these religions and thinking maybe they can provide some insight on reality. And so people turn to Buddhist meditation, things like Zen. They adopted certain Buddhist notions of reality. People turned to yoga. And sometimes these things were connected with the religious ideology that was behind it. I mean, if you think about yoga in India, it's often connected to a lot of religious things, but sometimes it's not in the United States. Right? It's more of a health or exercise type of thing. And so certainly a lot of people didn't convert to Hinduism or Buddhism, but co-opted certain of these Eastern practices, and many of them, would often create this kind of hybrid identity, where you might claim to be Lutheran, but you also incorporate Zen meditation. Right? So you're mixing and matching. Others, however, did drop a Christian identity and become Hindu or Buddhist, or at least kind of a westernized version of these traditions. So what you have here is this kind of pluralism with the increase of diversity, as well as people turning to be more welcoming to some of these views and trying to integrate them within their own religious systems, with their own versions of Christianity. We'll stop there because there's a couple political things that come out of this, like the removal of prayer in public schools and some other things that we'll talk about on Wednesday. So since that's kind of a shift, we'll pause there at the end of a discussion of immigration and pluralism as a factor out of that.